This talk is brought to you by the Bamberg Mathematical Consciousness Science Initiative.
Well, thank you both, Johannes and Roni, and thank you all for attending my talk. And yeah, it's a great pleasure to start off this workshop, which is on a topic that is really close to my heart. So I'm happy to contribute to this one. Yeah, it's really work in progress. So I'm very happy to hear your feedback and discuss with you if you think this is a good way to continue. And it's actually building on a discussion session that we organized in Granada last year. There was a workshop on consciousness organized by Martijn Wokkie. And we had a discussion with the audience there on integration in neuroscience. So it's also partly inspired by Martijn Wokkie and Lua Koenig, with whom I organized that. Yeah, so before I really start the talk, I have a very general overview of the workshop schedule for you. And then I start with my talk. So first I focus on the interdependence of conceptualization and measurement. Then we dive into fragmentation in consciousness science specifically. I will discuss if fragmentation is a problem, and then finally some ideas towards more integration of measurement in consciousness science. But to start with, then we all have had our own part of the introduction, I think. So the overall goal of the workshop, as Johannes already indicated, is to invite reflection about measurement theories in consciousness science in this case. So we have four general overarching goals of this workshop. To formulate the goals and the strata of a measurement theory in consciousness science. And here we are thinking about, well, are there specific problems or challenges in consciousness science that a measurement theory could or would solve? And what would the theory have to achieve in order to be useful for the field? Second, the feasibility of a measurement theory in consciousness science. So is consciousness science actually at the stage where a measurement theory is possible? And are there unique features of measurement in consciousness science that a measurement theory should accommodate? Then state of the art and existing work. So do we already have something that we can build upon? What's the state of the art of the theoretical understanding of measurement in our field? And finally, comparison with other fields. So if we zoom out a bit, what is required of a good measurement theory in psychology or cognitive neuroscience? Which theories do we have there, and can these be applied in consciousness science as well, or should they be adapted? So it's a very broad approach, I think, and all of the talks will give their own perspective on one or more of these questions. So this is the overview. So for today, I'm starting, as you can see, and here's the rest of the schedule. It's also in your email, so we have it distributed over the entire day. And importantly, we end with a general panel discussion to which you're all invited tonight for us in Europe. And tomorrow the schedule is similar. So we start in the morning here and end with the panel discussion. Okay. So just so you know, and you can attend all the talks or some of them, whatever you like, of course. Right, so then now I'm really starting with my talk. So I would like to begin with the starting point that how we measure affect what we study, or in other words, conceptualization and measurement are interdependent. And I have an example to show you why I think this is an important starting point for the way we study in cognitive neuroscience and also consciousness. So here is an example from, it's already 20 years old now, the study by Owen and colleagues about patients, unresponsive patients. Their study was really a breakthrough, because what they showed was that first we only had behavioral criteria to assess the conscious state of patients who were unresponsive. And they did an fMRI study where they asked these people questions, and even though they couldn't answer behaviorally, they could imagine a behavior, and they asked them to play tennis, for instance. And if they imagined playing tennis, they could find that some of them were able to actually answer the questions by using fMRI signals to decode if they were saying yes or no, so imagining playing tennis or not. So this was really a finding that was of clinical importance, reducing misdiagnosis resulting from considering only behavioral criteria. But interestingly, it's also led to a new diagnostic category, which is called cognitive motor dissociation. So what you can see here is that the introduction of new measurement techniques, such as fMRI in this case, produced a conceptual shift. What counts as conscious and unconscious depends on how you measure consciousness. And I think this is true for many new measurement techniques and also new conceptualizations, as I will show you in the remainder of my talk. So if this is the case, then a change in measurement may alter what is actually being measured. And you can depict it like this. So here we saw an example of a change in measurement techniques, which led to a change in theory or concepts, which can then inform maybe new measurement techniques, but can also work the other way around. If we have a new theory of consciousness, then likely we also need to come up with new or different methods to properly investigate the concepts. And this is not only true in neuroscience or consciousness research, but also in science more generally. And together with Riet van Bork, who is a speaker tomorrow morning, we organized a symposium at the latest European Philosophy of Science Association conference last year, with examples from psychology, seismology, sexology, where this cycle was visible. And this is also considered a mechanism for scientific progress. I will get back to that later in my talk. It's called epistemic iteration. So the idea is that you can also progress in science by going through these cycles multiple times. But yeah, for now, what's important, I think, is that there's a close interaction between conceptualization and measurement. And this is all fine, you could say, but in psychology, we have a problem because there's a situation of conceptual and methodological inconsistency and strong fragmentation. So this is a figure from a recent paper by Anvari and colleagues, and they showed that psychological science consists of a myriad of constructs and measures. So they found that tens of thousands of distinct constructs and measures have been proposed over the years, and many new ones are introduced each year. But most of them, like 80%, are not reused more than twice. So what you see here are tiles, and they each represent a measure, and the tile sizes are proportional to how often the measures have been used. So there are a couple of them that are reused very often on the left, but you see that we quickly end up with very small tiles, and that means that these are introduced but never reused again. And they think this is a problem, and I also think that's a problem, especially in this context, because if you change the measurement, it's not self-evident that you still measure the same thing, right? So if we have tens of thousands of different measures, then maybe we're measuring tens of thousands of different things, or at least likely not one thing, if that would be your aim. Okay, so also in cognitive neuroscience, there are complex experimental manipulation and measurement techniques, and this also produces a heterogeneous set of results from different methods and levels of investigation. And this raises questions about the possibility to integrate empirical research projects that intend to study the same phenomenon, but use different measurement methods. And this, I think this is my starting point, and also raise the question of how to improve this. And I think that's important, especially for consciousness science, because hopefully this will help to do better integration of research findings and therefore lead to more progress, but also can help to make better translations between science and society and lead to more impact in that way. Okay, so this is the starting point, and now I would like to move to consciousness science to see, well, whether this situation also holds there, and I think actually the answer is yes. Measurement problems are particularly evident in this field, and this is evident from a couple of things, maybe even more, but I want to highlight three. So there's currently a wide range of candidate theories of consciousness, partly due to ambiguity of the data, I would say. Yeah, I think people have written a lot about this, so I don't go into this any further, but I think it reflects the fact that there's ambiguity and inconsistency and fragmentation as well. Second, here also we can see that there's a variety of consciousness tasks and measures being used. I will show you more of this in a second. And thirdly, in our field, you can see that conceptual choices and assumptions influence which experiments are conducted and how outcomes are interpreted. And I will also give an example of this. Okay, so first I move on to one of my own studies, the consciousness survey that we performed a couple of years ago. So we asked consciousness researchers to fill out the survey with a lot of methodological and conceptual questions to assess the state of consciousness science. And I will highlight three of these questions that are relevant to the current talk about measurement. So one of the questions was, what are, in your opinion, the best ways to check whether stimuli are consciously perceived? And what you can see is that there's not a consensus on this, right? So you can see there were a lot of answer options, and yeah, there's a nice distribution of answers. So people generally like subjective measures here, so there's some consensus on, at least on this, but also other types of measures were preferred very often. And you can see a similar picture for the question about tasks. So which task that manipulates conscious perception have you used in your research? There's also a variety of tasks being used. Actually, there's also a book on consciousness phenomena and tasks that I think it includes hundreds of different procedures. And then we also asked a question about neural measures. So which neural measure do you think are the most likely indicators of signatures of conscious processing? And here again, yeah, it's basically all over the brain, different types of measures in time or location. So there's no consensus, and we clearly see that indeed a variety of conscious tasks and measures is being used and preferred in our field. And second, here are two figures from a paper by Itayeron from a couple of years ago, and he clearly showed that conceptual choices and assumptions influence which experiments are conducted and how outcomes are interpreted. So what you see here in the upper panel are four different theories of consciousness, and what they show is that the measures that the different theories use in their research, or the research that interprets their findings in light of one of these theories, clearly differ. So if you compare the third circle with the fourth, you clearly see that the measures that are being used are very different. And this has clear consequences because they could predict from the methodological choices what theory would be supported by the data. So I think this is really severe problem, because then we don't have to do any experiments anymore. The lower panel shows that if we want to locate the neural correlates of consciousness, this also becomes problematic because yeah, basically the entire brain lights up if you do a meta-analysis of the different studies. So because we use so many different measures related to different theories or concepts, yeah, we lose the specificity that we're actually yeah, would want to have. So ideally you would see one particular location in the brain or maybe a network, but this is clearly not the case. So I think this fragmentation is clearly visible, and it's also problematic in this case because our yeah, the way we can interpret the experimental results becomes less meaningful if this is our situation. Okay, but I would like to discuss this question explicitly. So is fragmentation actually a problem? And to start positively, you could say no, because comparing results of multiple measures or methods offers more robust insights. That's a general idea in science. We can verify if findings converge, and then we can say that we found a true effect rather than an artifact resulting from using a particular measurement method that might actually show something but not really related to what we want to study. So if we use multiple methods and still find the same pattern of results, that might give us a reason to believe that we're really after something. Right, so multiple measures can capture different aspects of phenomenon, and they can also complement and even compensate for each other, but for instance, by reducing bias introduced by one particular method. And yeah, there's a quote here from a paper, older paper by Anil Seth and colleagues. So they propose something like this. They say an integrative approach combines combining both type, in this case, two type of measures in a single study, encourages a virtuous circularity in which putative measures and theoretical advances mutually inform, validate, and refine one another. So you can also see the cycle here. So they really believe that this is a good thing to have. There's also one downside of this idea, namely that a systematic procedure for such integration is currently lacking in the field, and I think actually in cognitive neuroscience as a whole. So it's a nice ideal, but we don't really live up to it. Okay, fragmentation is a problem actually if we assume one unified concept of consciousness. And many people actually assume this. So everybody who thinks we are after the true or just the NCC assumes that there's one unified concept of consciousness and that there's also one NCC that underlies this phenomenon, neurocorrelate of consciousness. Yeah, I'm not going into this entire discussion, but for now it's relevant to know that we haven't found a stable and invariant NCC that's really specific, as I also showed in the figure from Jeroen's study. So this assumption might be questionable, or at least it hasn't really resulted in the NCC that we're actually looking for, that we're looking for already for more than 25 years, I think. And here I think it's interesting to relate to measurement theories or to psychometrics, because this is an assumption that I think many people share. And I think this really fits nicely with the latent variable model that's used in psychometrics, where constructs are seen as common causes. So in psychometrics, people use the terms, in psychology in general, constructs. So in cognitive neuroscience, we sometimes also use constructs, but also concepts, or a more realist term. But the idea here is that no, I want to wait with this, that there's a phenomenon or construct, and that underlies different indicators. So if you want to say something about C, you want to infer something about C, but the only thing you can do is measure x1 to x4, and then measurement theory helps you to relate the outcomes of your indicators back to the C that you actually wanted to infer something about. So this is called a latent construct because it cannot directly be observed, which is also the case, of course, with consciousness. And there's mathematical modeling involved to connect the item scores back to the latent construct. But this can be done in different ways, so different measurement theories here, as for instance, classical test theory and item response theory, to name two common ones, to assess the unobservable or latent constructs. But there are different ways of doing this. And also, in this case, I showed you this model of a construct as a common cause, because I think this is what the assumption of one unified concept of consciousness actually would mean. But recently, and also in Reed's talk, we'll highlighted that there's recently a move to seeing some construct in a different way, for instance, as networks. And if you reconceptualize constructs in this way, then that has also consequences for how you measure them, or ideally that would have consequence for how you measure them, and also what you assume about what consciousness is. So I think here there's really an applicability for measurement theories to make these kind of assumptions more explicit, make the relationship between the constructs and the measurement more explicit and mathematical, and also give us more different options for how we actually conceptualize consciousness. Okay, I have more answers to this question. Is fragmentation a problem? Well, less so if we assume that consciousness is a multifaceted phenomenon, right? And there are also people who take this perspective. So for instance, in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Van Gulik says, consciousness is a complex feature of the world, and understanding it will require a diversity of conceptual tools for dealing with its many different aspects. So that's really clearly a different conceptualization compared to the assumption of one unified concept for the NCC, right? So we can also take this perspective, and then that would of course have consequence for how we measure and integrate. But then the question arises, how do we avoid a fragmented situation in which these endeavors run in parallel and proceed relatively independently? So here a quote from your own study that's relevant here. Solely on the basis of certain methodological choices, for example, using report versus no report paradigms or studying content versus state consciousness, we could predict whether the experiment would end up supporting each of the theories. I already noted this. And this might represent the different emphasis put by each theory on different aspects of consciousness. So I think this is really interesting because we say that we are studying consciousness, a unified thing, and we're after the true NCC. But actually, if you look at how people are measuring and operationalizing, you see that they do different things. They have different conceptualizations or different aspects, resulting in different methodological choices, different measurements, and also obviously resulting in fragmented data. So again, here, this is less of a problem if we would have a systematic procedure for integration, but we don't have that. Okay, and then finally, there's also a strong a strong yes to this question. So Liz Irvine says, yeah, this is definitely a problem because, and also she's an eliminativist of the scientific concept of consciousness. She says that consciousness is not a viable scientific concept. So here are a couple of things that she claims. So she says researchers are probing wildly different phenomena by using different production, measurement, and detection procedures. Well, we've actually seen that that's the case. Markers and measures are not independent. Experimental tasks correlate with brain responses. We've also seen that that is the case. And she argues that there's no progress in the development of the theoretical framework. So the conceptual side of things, we just talk about consciousness. So we have different theories, but actually still we all think we're explaining the same phenomena, consciousness. There's no progress in refining these in this concept or using subcategories, except for phenomenal and active consciousness maybe. But if you compare, for instance, to the field of memory, they have a whole taxonomy of different types of memory. Something like this is not happening in her field. So she's really pessimistic. And she says that whatever explanations we end up with, they will be pluralist, piecemeal, and unlikely to amount to anything coherent enough to count as an explanation of consciousness. Okay, so that's also an answer to this question. But if we don't want to go along with her, then we need to provide an answer to the question that I stated in the beginning of my talk. So how to integrate empirical research projects that intend to study consciousness but use different measurement methods. And as I said, theories propose or presuppose conceptualizations, operationalized in a specific way in measurements and producing theory-laden data. So we're not here yet. And actually, I would say there's no real evidence integration currently happening. So how to improve this? I think there are different strategies, and many people have focused on data. So for instance, from Paul Drake's lab, not in the context of consciousness, but in cognitive neuroscience in general, they hope to do bottom-up data analysis to find convergence in some way. Recently, people focus a lot on theories. So how can we integrate at the level of theories? And for instance, the adversarial collaborations are an example of this to solve the problem at the level of theories. And I would propose a third alternative, which is focus on measurement, in line with several others who also have made related proposals. And I think this is a good strategy because it will address the root causes of the conceptual and methodological inconsistency and fragmentation. Because I think that a lot comes down to this interdependence of conceptualization and measurement, and that's actually the level where we have to start. So now my talk becomes more of a working project. So I think I've put together 3 questions or directions that are really related to measurement that I think would be interesting to start with, because they are directly related to the fragmentation that that is the case, I think. So one is that we can look at the fact that we measure very or slightly different things under the same label of consciousness, as Irvine also indicated. So maybe we have to work on this to refinement of our conceptual taxonomy. We rarely specify when 2 measurement methods are equivalent or comparable, whether they really measure the same thing. So this might be something that measurement theories could possibly contribute to, right? To make this more explicit, how we can do that. And thirdly, we now have no normative criteria to evaluate old or new measures of consciousness. And I think this is also something that measurement theories can provide. And that's needed, especially in the light of this fragmentation of measures. So if everybody can just introduce another measure and we have no idea or no way to assess whether this is actually a good measure or a valuable measure or meaningful measure, then that will not necessarily lead to more integration, I think. So these are just questions that I think are directly related to measurements and the connection with conceptualization that might be worth focusing on. And then, I think I'm okay time-wise. So I want to highlight 2 concepts that I think are also related to measurement and especially relevant in this context. So first is construct validity. You probably all heard of construct validity. It's a psychological concept, and it's crucial in psychometrics. So there are different types of validity in different fields, and there are even different accounts of construct validity. So there's not one definition, but I would like to highlight here a proposal by Caroline Stone in the context of psychology. And what is interesting here is that she distinguishes construct validity from construct legitimacy and existence claims. So we have the construct again, so that's consciousness in our case. And then the metaphysical discussion is on existence claims, right? So does consciousness exist or not? Is consciousness really something that exists in the world? So that's the arrow on the right. So we can discuss that if we want. But we can disconnect that from the more methodological discussions. And then the most interesting distinction, I think, is between construct legitimacy and construct validity. Because if you follow Irvine and say, consciousness is not a good scientific concept, then she would also say that the measures are not construct valid. But Stone says, well, maybe we can still do sensible research, because if we take construct validity as the validity of the measures relative to the construct, then construct validity really is about how well the measure measures the construct. But that can also be part of the construct, for instance. So if our construct overall is not legitimate, that that could be the case because it's too broad or lumpy, then we can still measure maybe aspects of it that are valid. So in this way, if you would say consciousness is not a legitimate construct, then many people would from that infer that conscious tasks are also invalid. But here she distinguishes the two. So that might be helpful for us. So because we can proceed with our research even though the construct is not fully developed yet. So we can do that in the meantime. So I think this might be something to more explicitly assess or test in our consciousness science. And second, I want to come back to the concept of epistemic iteration that I mentioned in the beginning. So Hansok Chang has written a lot about this and introduced this concept in his book Inventing Temperature. So here, this is a historical study of temperature in the physical sciences. But he claims that scientific progress is actually happening in this cycle. So we start out with the kind of rudimentary theory or concept. Then we start to measure it in some way. Then we find out that actually we should refine our theory or concept, leading to new measurement distinctions, for instance. Sometimes there's new technology being introduced, as we saw in the patient's example, which also demands a change in theory. And in this way, we can actually make progress. And I think these days we're talking a lot about progress in consciousness science, right? How to make progress. Can we do that by doing adversarial collaborations? And this is an alternative account on progress that's directly connected to measurement. So I think this is also something worth exploring to see if this holds in consciousness science. And for instance, I said, well, we measure different things under the same label. So are we actually in the same cycle, or are we running in parallel cycles, or are we cycling out of it each time we introduce a new measure? And what can we actually do to stay in the same loop? Right. So these are ideas for future projects, and I'm really curious to hear your thoughts about this. So that brings me to my conclusion. Consciousness science is characterized by conceptual and methodological inconsistency and fragmentation. And fragmentation is a problem, I think, if we assume one unified concept of consciousness and neglect the need for developing systematic integration procedures. And finally, emphasizing measurement will reveal concrete opportunities for making progress. And then finally, I want to highlight my current research project, which I call the Measurement Toolbox Project. So I'm trying to develop a philosophical toolbox for measurement in cognitive neuroscience in general and testing this in case studies on consciousness. And with this, I really want to address the root causes of inconsistency and fragmentation. And you can read more about this here. So this is a snapshot of the website. So I'm currently working at the Netherlands Institute for Advanced Study on this this semester. And if you're interested, then please contact me and we can talk more about this. Okay, well, thank you first of all to Johannes for organizing this and Roni for co-organizing, and to my group, the Cognitive and Systems Neuroscience group at the University of Amsterdam, the NIAS where I'm currently based, and also, of course, all of you for attending my talk. Thanks.